Ah, here it is, one of the most exciting and turbulent periods in history, the French Revolution. A kingdom that had ruled with absolute power for centuries was beginning to shake under the anger of the people, and the splendor of the palaces was giving way to chaos. A crowd shouting liberty, equality, fraternity poured into the streets, determined to put an end to years of oppression. As France awakened with this uprising in the capital, Paris, the overthrow of kings had sparked one of the greatest revolutions in history. But what triggered this revolution? Why did the old regime begin to crumble? How did a new republic come to be? Well, if you're curious about all these questions, come along as we embark on a journey to the heart of this revolutionary fire. The French Revolution. It feels like remembering an old friend. When I think about it, it almost feels like it was just yesterday. Those turbulent times, the kingdoms trembling, the nobles nervously glancing at each other, and the people impatiently searching for justice. But to truly understand this revolution, we first need to picture old France, the so-called old regime. So close your eyes and imagine this. France in the late 1700s. Kings and nobles living in luxury in their glass palaces, practically flaunting their wealth as if it were a divine blessing, continuing their lives with no care for the struggles of the common people. Meanwhile, the people, worn out from working the land, were burdened with taxes and responsibilities, crushed and powerless. Back then, France was built on a rigid class system, my dear listeners. Society was divided into three classes: the nobles, the clergy, and finally the third estate, which was the common people. The nobles held nearly all the power and had no responsibility toward the people. This class, exempt from taxes, owned the most fertile lands in France, and their injustices were often seen as a sacred right. The clergy, the supposed guardians of faith, shared their power with the king and the nobles while living lavishly off the great wealth reserved for them. And then, the struggling people. The deep injustice gnawing at the heart of the people planted the seeds of rebellion. The third estate, which made up the vast majority of the population, included everyone from farmers to workers, peasants to city merchants. However, this massive crowd could do nothing but bear the weight of the country's burdens, taxes, debts, and poverty. And on top of that, they were condemned to live their entire lives crushed under this weight. Oh, there was so much anger building up in their hearts, but no one had the courage to express it because the walls of the old regime seemed too strong. At least, that's what they thought. So, how would this rigid system fall apart? How would this divided people come together to start a revolution that would change all of France? Now, let's begin to uncover the crises behind those unjust days, the sparks that pushed French society into rebellion. Are you ready? The French Revolution. It's almost like remembering an old friend. When I think back, it feels like it was just yesterday, those turbulent times. A kingdom on the brink, nobles looking anxiously at one another, while the people, full of frustration, poured into the streets searching for justice. But to understand this revolution, we first need to picture old France the structure of the old regime in our minds. Now, close your eyes and imagine France in the late 1700s. Kings and nobles floating in luxury in their glass palaces, living their lives almost as if their wealth were a gift they had to show off to the people. Meanwhile, the common folk were worn out from working the land, burdened with responsibilities, crushed by taxes, left powerless. Back then, France was built on a rigid class system, my dear listeners. Society was divided into three classes: the nobility, the clergy, and, last but not least, the third estate. The nobility, with their birthright privileges, ruled over France's land, holding the country's most fertile territories. Living in luxury, there had not been this kind of dysfunctional guilt for hundreds of years. Living in luxury, they had no idea what the people were going through. These nobles were exempt from taxes, avoiding all responsibilities. They didn't pay a penny in taxes, nor did they share in the struggles of the people. To them, France was just a place to live in comfort, completely oblivious to the burden on the backs of the people, the struggles of the peasants. On the other hand, we had the clergy, the religious class. The clergy was seen as God's representatives on earth, and their influence over the people was enormous. Even though they had a spiritual mission, much of the church was deeply involved in political power. With their own land, tax exemptions, and the heavy load placed on the common people, the church's power in France wasn't only felt in matters of faith, but in everyday life as well. The clergy, though they could sense the rising anger among the people, often chose to turn a blind eye to it. As the church grew wealthier, the people grew poorer, yet the clergy saw themselves as equals to the nobility, or even superior to them. And my dear friends, beneath all this grandeur and power, there was the third estate, the real heart of the story. The third estate was made up of the common people, farmers, workers, merchants, craftsmen, and so on. But their lives were very different from those of the nobles or the clergy. Taxes hung around their necks like a heavy chain. Much of their labor went to the state or to the nobles. They worked, toiled, paid, but could never escape their burdens. Bread was not just hard to come by, it was as though it was hidden away in the farthest corners of the palace. As the nobles' wealth increased, the people grew poorer, and life became even harder. In this system, most of the people lived on the edge of hunger, deep in poverty. Imagine a peasant walking through the streets of Paris during that time, calloused hands, a face weathered by the wind, and eyes that showed the hopelessness of the times. Every peasant, every worker, every craftsman was becoming angrier as they were crushed under this system. But how much courage it would take to voice that anger, to turn it into a revolt in front of the towering walls of the palace. How long could the common people endure all this injustice? Who knows? Maybe in the future of France, their voices would rise like an avalanche against these colossal powers. But how would this old regime end? What could the monarchy and nobility do against the growing anger of the people? Well, now we'll talk about France's worsening economic crisis and those tough times that pushed the people to their breaking point. Now, my dear friends, let me take you into the heart of France's harsh economic crisis. a time when people were struggling in poverty and despair. This wasn't just a period of hardship, it was a time when the hopes, patience, and even the will to live of the people were slowly slipping away. Come, let's dive deep into this crisis and see how the economic collapse that shook France also fueled the growing dissatisfaction among the people. By the end of the 18th century, France found itself buried under a massive debt. A huge part of this debt came from the country's involvement in the American Revolution. France had spent heavily supporting America in its fight against England, sending troops, providing weapons, and supplying materials. But after the war, it was America that enjoyed the victory, and all France got in return was an overwhelming debt and drained coffers. And who ended up paying the price? The common people of France. Common people of France. Every burning candle and every expensive piece of decor came from the pockets of the people. It was their bread that was being taken away. Keeping hope alive was becoming harder and harder as life grew tougher with each passing day. Alongside the economic crisis, famine and hunger were knocking at the door. Crops were withering in the fields across France, and the prices of basic foods like flour and wheat were constantly rising. Bread, which should have been a staple, was becoming a luxury. Picture a farmer walking through the streets of Paris during those days. He had worked all day just to bring home some bread, yet could barely afford a small piece. It wasn't just hunger the French people felt during those times. They were also deeply aware of the injustice surrounding them. For the nobles and the clergy, these struggles seemed to be invisible. Life continued in all its grandeur in the royal palaces, untouched by the suffering of the common people. The chasm between these two extremes in France was growing wider, and the anger in the hearts of the people was intensifying. The tax system was like a chain around the people's necks. Nobles and clergy were exempt from taxes, while the entire burden fell on the Third Estate. Not only were they paying taxes, but they also had to hand over most of their crops and earnings to the nobles and the church. With every harvest, every market, the nobles' coffers were filling up, while the people's coffers were filling up with joy. Dead system didn't just leave people poor, it trampled their dignity underfoot. Farmers, craftsmen, small merchants, they were all losing what little they had, with despair following them like a shadow. But in the midst of this, the desire for justice grew stronger each day, and the people waited, hoping for a day when things would change. During these difficult days, the only thing being discussed in the streets, in the markets, and at the inns was justice. Every peasant, every worker was searching for it. Some were looking for justice at the gates of the kingdom, while others were already whispering that it was time to rise up against the system. France could feel the unrest building beneath the surface, and the people were waiting for that spark to ignite the flames. The voices echoing outside the palace walls would one day change the course of France's future. But my dear friends, how would the people fight against this injustice? Who would step up to the front lines of this battle? And most importantly, how would the monarchy respond to the rising anger? We'll uncover the answers to all these questions in the next chapter. Are you ready? My dear friends, Now I'm going to take you to one of France's deepest tremors, a time when reason and freedom began to sprout, and a new light was born in the hearts of people. These were the times when Enlightenment ideas were rising, quietly but powerfully planting the seeds for a revolution all across France. These ideas were so powerful that they not only illuminated people's minds, but also sowed a longing in their hearts for a fairer and freer world. So come, let's dive together into the story of this new world shaped by the great thinkers and their ideas. During this period, new ideas echoed not only in the cafes, streets, and salons of the common people, but even in the aristocrats' palaces. Behind these ideas were great philosophers like Rousseau, Voltaire, and Montesquieu. They were making sharp critiques of their time, and in every line, they carried the breath of liberty, equality, and justice. With Rousseau's social contract, the people began to embrace the idea of a world where not only the aristocracy, but everyone had rights. These bold words spread like a wave, becoming a call for hope and change among the people. Rousseau saw society with new eyes, placing individual rights at the very foundation of social order. Imagine, dear friends, people who had devoted their entire lives to submission and obedience were now beginning to see themselves as masters. This was a revolutionary step for that time. Voltaire, on the other hand, argued for the separation of church and state, challenging the oppressive power of the church. His sharp words echoed in the hearts of people tired of the church's domination. "We don't need the church to love God," he practically shouted, against the church's seemingly sacred but oppressive structure. Voltaire's brave words resonated, planting the seeds of freedom in people's minds. Thanks to him, people began to search for freedom and found the courage to question their own thoughts. Isn't that incredible, dear friends? The liberation of minds was giving birth to humanity's deepest awakening. And of course, Montesquieu, this brilliant man who questioned the structure of the state and the distribution of power, introduced the principle of the separation of powers. He argued that the concentration of power in one hand was the root of injustice, and that the legislative, executive, and judicial branches should be separate. Montesquieu's revolutionary idea was a direct challenge to the absolute power of monarchies. The people were no longer simply accepting the king's absolute rule. They now believed that power should be distributed fairly, not concentrated in one person. The power hidden behind the king's palace walls was quickly unraveling in the eyes of the people, influenced by these new ideas. Across France, the fire of freedom, justice, and equality was burning brightly in the hearts of the people. These ideas were not just taking root in the minds of philosophers, but were also spreading among the people. The notions of liberty, equality, and fraternity were becoming a growing wave of hope in the hearts of the people, sweeping across France. The lavish lives of the aristocracy, the church's oppression, and the unjust tax system. All these heavy burdens that had crushed the people were now making them feel more valuable and powerful thanks to these ideas. Imagine, dear friends, a people who had been silenced, pushed aside, and cornered for centuries were now awakening and realizing their own strength. No longer would anyone be able to rule them as before. And now I can't help but ask, dear friends, as these powerful ideas began to enlighten the people, What would the representatives of the power do in response to these new thoughts? And how would France step into the future after this intellectual revolution? Let's see how these new ideas would change the course of history. My dear friends, let me take you back to one of France's most turbulent times, a period when a nation was on the brink of boiling over, desperately searching for a new identity. The year is 1789. Across France, there were echoes of anger, hunger, and injustice. The people were ready to break free from the grip of the nobility and the church. As King Louis XVI desperately searched for the solution to the financial crisis that had gripped the country, he finally decided to call together an old institution, the Estates General, which had not met in centuries. But did the king truly understand the power he was about to face? Come, let's relive this dramatic moment in history. France's finances were in ruins, and the royal treasury had been drained. Support for the American Revolution and the endless lavish spending by the nobility had torn apart the state's financial structure. When Louis XVI decided to convene the Estates General, he unknowingly sparked the fuse of a social awakening that would change the country forever. The Estates General, which had met only 3 times in history, was one of the most effective tools for representing the people, but it had not been convened in the last 2 centuries. Now, representatives from all over France were heading to Paris to make their voices heard. The Estates General was made up of 3 estates: the nobility, the clergy, and the common people, known as the Third Estate. While the nobles and the clergy were intent on preserving their privileges, the representatives of the Third Estate were demanding justice and equality. As the assembly gathered, whispers were replaced by rising voices in the grand halls of Versailles. Representatives from the Third Estate, fueled by years of frustration, were finally raising their voices. They had long been denied justice, burdened by taxes, and treated with disdain. Now they had a chance to express their grievances. Each one was echoing the cries of the people from all corners of France. Yes, my friends, in those halls, it wasn't just words that were heard. It was the sound of revolution. King Louis XVI, perhaps hoping to calm the people, had called the assembly. But the demands of the Third Estate were not just about financial reform or a new tax system. They were rejecting the label of the lower class that had been assigned to them and were demanding fair representation. What a transformation this was. The people, long overshadowed by the nobility and silenced by the pressures of the church, were now in the center of the action, making their voices heard in the heart of France. The representatives of the Third Estate came together in the middle of the hall and cried out, "We are here too!" The demand for liberty, equality, and fraternity echoed from every corner. So powerful was their cry that even the president of the assembly struggled to keep it under control. The Third Estate was demanding voting rights, demanding a say in the decisions of the nation. But the nobility and clergy, entrenched in centuries of privilege, were not ready to give up their superiority. From the very first day, the debates were filled with tension, conflict, arguments, accusations. The walls of the palace were echoing with the marks of this great struggle which would determine the future of France. While the royal palace dazzled with luxury and splendor, it was now resonating not with the demands of the nobility, but with the rightful claims of the people. King Louis XVI, faced with this scene, was left bewildered. The anger of the people, the resistance of the nobility. Could Louis XVI manage to steer this turbulent period, or would this massive wave of change break through the palace walls and shake the entire nation? Ah, my dear friends, do you think the demands of the Third Estate would be accepted and that the voice of the people would truly be heard? Ah. Or was this awakening the harbinger of a much greater storm? In the next chapter, we will see where this historic conflict leads us. Ah, my dear friends, let me take you back to those magnificent yet turbulent days in France, to that pivotal moment in history when the people began to take their fate into their own hands. It was the year 1789. All across France, anger and impatience among the people were growing stronger by the day. With the calling of the Estates General, the Third Estate was no longer content just to be represented. They wanted to make their voices heard loud and clear. These were the people who had been looked down upon, belittled, and left in poverty until that moment. But now, before the eyes of all of France, they were showing their determination. They wanted change, they wanted equality, and they were demanding the justice they deserved. Oh, friends, what a monumental event this was. The representatives of the Third Estate, in those vast halls of the palace, declared that they could no longer tolerate the injustice done to them. The debates had heated up, and tensions were rising by the minute. The nobles and the clergy had turned a deaf ear to the demands of the Third Estate, relying on the traditional power of the monarchy, but the people's representatives didn't back down. The brave men and women of the Third Estate were now shouting that they no longer wanted to be a part of this old system. And right at that moment, the decision that would go down in history was made. The representatives of the Third Estate declared themselves as a separate assembly. This was the spark of a revolution. No longer were they a part of the Estates General, which held the kingdom's authority. Now they were a body of their own, calling themselves the National Assembly, representing the will of the people of France. They had given themselves a new name and made it known to the world that they were the true representatives of the French people. The declaration of this new assembly would be remembered as the first victory of the people. What a courageous act, my friends. Those who were in that hall that day couldn't have known yet that this movement would set the stage for a revolution, but a spark had been lit. A wind of change was beginning to blow, pushing away the heavy, oppressive atmosphere that had lulled the world into a daze, sadness. And then, oh, that unforgettable moment, the oath on the tennis court. The members of the National Assembly gathered in a tennis court and took an oath that would change the course of history. Despite all the pressure, despite all the threats, they vowed not to give up on this fight. These people, representing the will of the French people, swore to resist until their last breath if necessary, to ensure justice was done. The voices that echoed in that court were no longer individual cries, but the collective voice of a unified and powerful will. "We will win this fight. We will protect the rights of our people," they swore. That moment marked the time when the winds of change began to blow across France, and the first flames of the revolution were lit. In every word of that oath, there were traces of the great struggle for liberty, equality, and justice. Yes, my dear friends, it was on that day that the fate of France began to be rewritten with pen and paper in hand. The founding of the National Assembly marked the moment when the old order was shaken and the people finally found their power. So now, what do you think will happen next? How will the nobles and the king respond to the resolve of the people? Is a true revolution on the horizon? Let's find out together in the next chapter as we explore the next step in this great struggle. My dear friends, let's now take a journey together to that unforgettable day, to that moment in history that changed the course of time forever. It was July of 1789, and the streets of France were buzzing with deep anger and anxiety. Poverty, injustice, hunger, and the fury that had been building up in the people for years were boiling over in the narrow streets of Paris. In such a climate, the patience of the people had finally run out. A movement full of passion, pain, and hope was about to take its first steps. A revolution was about to begin. On the morning of July 14th, behind the dark clouds that covered Paris's sky, a great noise erupted. The Bastille, that massive prison which had become a symbol of oppression and cruelty in the eyes of the people, was now the target of their fury. This ancient fortress had been a place not only for prisoners but also for the kingdom's fear and authority. The cold stone walls that symbolized the reign of the French king represented a structure built on hatred and fear from the people. The prisoners held inside were the symbol of centuries of oppression, injustice, and silence. But now, the people would not stay silent. As the crowds began marching toward the Bastille, each step carried the powerful desire for freedom. Women, men, the young, the old, all had gathered in front of those walls, hoping for a change. Some carried sticks, others rocks, surrounding the fortress with fury. It was as if behind those stones, not just prisoners, but every oppressive system that held the people's dark emotions captive were locked away. This was an uprising, my friends. With every strike against the Bastille's walls, it echoed like an oath. We will take back our freedom. And finally, that moment arrived. The crowd forced open those massive iron gates. The Bastille, unable to resist the determination of the people any longer, fell. The fall of the Bastille marked the end of not just a prison, but an era. In that moment, the silence that fell over the Bastille was like an announcement of the closing of a chapter in history. A beacon of hope spread across all of France. The fall of the Bastille became the symbolic beginning of the revolution because the people had realized that they had the power to topple even the strongest structures. This attack symbolized that nothing would ever be the same again. With the fall of the Bastille, a new era for liberty had begun in France. Now, the people would speak not from behind the walls of fear, but in the open, hopeful squares. They would raise their will like a fortress and make their voices heard against the kingdom. The same question was on everyone's lips. Were the real days of the revolution just beginning? The gates of change had been flung wide open, but where would this journey take France? Oh, my dear friends, aren't you curious too? How far would the fire of this revolution spread, and whose lives would it change? In the next chapter, we will explore how this great storm echoed across all of France. Are you ready? My dear friends, now we are at the heart of the revolution. We are about to witness those unforgettable days when the powerful feudal chains that had surrounded France for centuries were broken one by one, and the people awoke to a hopeful dawn. After the fall of the Bastille, a spark began to light inside every Frenchman's heart. That spark was the flame of freedom, equality, and fraternity. But this journey wasn't just about the destruction of a prison. The true depth of the revolution lay in the desire to fundamentally change the social structure that centuries had built. Right after the fall of the Bastille, the people weren't just seeking freedom, they were now in search of social justice. Until that point, the feudal rights that a handful of nobles enjoyed over the French land weighed like a heavy burden on millions of people. The people might have owned the land, but to work it, they had to pay taxes to the nobles with every step they took, with every crop they harvested. Across all of France, these laborers were losing their food to the nobles and being crushed by horrific taxes. But this wasn't just a financial burden. The feudal system stripped the people of their basic human rights, disregarding their dignity. But now, it was time for that system to change. On the night of August 4th, 1789, an unforgettable day unfolded in France. The National Assembly, burning with the fire of revolution, decided to completely dismantle the old system. That night, the nobles began to renounce all their privileges. Each step they took marked the destruction of feudal rights. No one would carry the burden of another any longer. The dependency on land that oppressed the people was over. The deep gap between the rich and the poor started to slowly close. A promise of equality for all had been made, and the people, with the weight lifted from their shoulders, felt like they could breathe again. It was as if they were one step closer to that free future they had dreamed of for centuries. And right at this moment, one of the most important steps of the revolution was taken: the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. My friends, this declaration was so powerful that the hope spreading across France was now solidified in a real document. The Declaration granted unprecedented rights to every citizen, not just in France, but around the world. Liberty, equality, fraternity, the Declaration said. Now, every individual had inalienable rights, and these rights didn't depend on nobility or wealth. All it took was being human. Freedom was no longer just a dream, it was seen as a right. Equality was not a cry, but a fundamental right for every citizen. Fraternity had become a sacred bond that united society. This declaration offered not only rights to the people of that day, but also a legacy to pass on to future generations. No one could rule over another because everyone was equal before the law. Every individual had the right to express themselves and live a just life. This new world would be one created by the people themselves. A revolution would not be elevated by power alone, but by these rights. So, my dear friends, As the echoes of this declaration spread across France, could the people really achieve the ideals of freedom, equality, and fraternity? Ah, my dear listeners, imagine this: a king who has been at the pinnacle of power for centuries, almost seen as God's representative on earth, slowly losing his influence in the eyes of the people. This is one of those pivotal moments, sparked by the fire of revolution, that brought a wave of change to France, the birth of the Constitution of 1791, and the efforts to transition to a constitutional monarchy. At that time, France was in turmoil, filled with dreams of justice, equality, and freedom. People were loudly declaring that they no longer wanted to live under the arbitrary decisions of a king. Before the revolution, kings ruled based on their own desires and the interests of the noble class, while the vast majority of the population, the common people, were crushed under the weight of this system. Now, that great mass of people was burning with a desire to put an end to this oppression and create a government that represented their will. The 1791 Constitution was a reflection of these desires. It marked a turning point in French history because, for the first time, the king's powers were being limited and a constitutional order was being attempted. The idea behind this was that the king should no longer have absolute authority. Of course, the king was still a monarch, but he now had to act within a framework that reflected the will of the people. So what did this mean? It meant the king couldn't do whatever he wanted anymore. The country's governance would now involve not just the king's authority, but also a parliament made up of representatives of the people. This was the greatest innovation the French had heard in years, because now the voice of the people would echo in the halls of the parliament. The process of drafting this constitution was painful, but full of hope. Everyone's eyes and ears were focused on Paris, under the roof of the National Assembly. The process of drafting this constitution was painful, that was genuinely great and important. Hell's focus and contributed to some of the most important events in our history. Everyone's heart and mind were focused on the country, closed in peace. The king's supporters believed that this change would weaken the country, while the people thought that this new order would open the doors to freedom. After long debates and discussions, the 1791 Constitution was completed. With this constitution, the first steps were taken toward a government based on the will of the people in France. The king's power was limited, and laws could no longer be passed without the approval of the people's representatives. This was the first glimmer of the equality and justice the people had long dreamed of. But my friends, the response to this constitution in the hearts of the people didn't always go as hoped. King Louis XVI, although he declared that he would follow the constitution, was secretly opposed to this new system. Rumors spread quickly among the people. Whispers were heard that the king and the nobility were not at all happy with this new order and were secretly waiting for a chance to regain their old powers. As the king and his entourage resisted the requirements of the constitutional monarchy, the people's patience began to wear thin. The changes brought by the constitution weren't providing the peace and stability that French people had hoped for. And here I want to leave you with a question. Would King Louis truly adapt to this new order? Or would he set aside the will of the people and make his own plans to regain his throne and power? Well, my dear friends, we will continue turning the pages of history to find the answer to this question. My dear friends, across all of France there was a wave of hope, a dream of freedom, fueled by the excitement of the revolution. But that hope quickly turned into disappointment in the hands of a leader who was supposed to remain at the heart of the people's vision. King Louis XVI. And now we'll talk about the event that shook the revolution to its core and planted a huge seed of doubt in the hearts of the people. The King Louis XVI. It was a warm summer day in 1791. The revolution had spread across all of French territory, and the people were hoping they would finally experience the freedoms promised by the new constitution that limited the monarchy's power. But inside the palace, storms were brewing, and very different plans were being made. King Louis was bothered by the limitations imposed by the new constitution and couldn't bear the thought of losing his power. While the people outside embraced the hope of a new order, the king and his noble circle had very different ideas. Louis and Queen Marie Antoinette secretly planned to escape the palace, to flee from the anger of the people and the change of the revolution, in hopes of returning to their former glory. And finally, the dark night arrived. Taking his family with him, King Louis left the palace secretly in what appeared to be an ordinary carriage. Imagine this: France's king acting like a fugitive, sneaking through the streets under cover of night. This was the first sign of the major changes brought about by the revolution. The king was now running from his people, who had become not only his subjects, but a threat in his eyes. Louis thought that by crossing the border, he could reach safety and reclaim his former splendor on foreign soil. Oh, but fate had other plans. Every hour spent on the road became a symbol in the eyes of the people. However, this escape didn't last long. When Louis and his family arrived in the town of Varennes, they were recognized and quickly captured by the local people, who returned them to Paris. Just think about it. The King of France, the most noble man in the land, had lost all his grandeur in front of the revolution and the people, and was caught like an ordinary fugitive. On the journey back to Paris, his image in the eyes of the people changed completely. Louis was no longer seen as a leader who would protect his people, but rather as a fugitive trying to abandon his country for his own benefit. The people of France now saw clearly that he had never felt any true loyalty to the revolution or their demands. After this event, trust among the people was shattered, and even the new order they had been so hopeful about was now questioned. The king, in their eyes, was far from his throne. He had come to symbolize betrayal. This growing anger among the people would further radicalize the revolution and intensify the cries for liberty and equality that echoed through the streets of France. So, my dear friends, how far can a king go once he loses the trust of his people? The answer to this question would push France toward an even more turbulent, even bloody chapter in its history. My dear friends, today we're going to talk about a time when the fire of revolution in France didn't just burn within its own borders, but sent sparks that would shake all of Europe. The revolution wasn't just about the hopes, anger, and longing for freedom of the French people. It became a nightmare threatening the old monarchies of Europe. In France, the Bastille had fallen, the king's powers were limited, and the flag of revolution began to fly across the country. But these developments weren't exactly sitting well with the monarchies outside of France. At that time, all across Europe, nobles, kings, even the royal courts were watching what was happening in France with growing concern. They couldn't help but wonder, will our people too be swept up in these cries for freedom? If revolutionary ideas from France spread across borders and echoed throughout Europe, it could bring down monarchies, and the people could rise up against centuries-old absolutist rule. Not long after, a sense of panic started to grow in the royal courts of Europe. What was happening in France was no longer just an internal issue, but a threat that could shake the entire established order. And this fear, my friends, is what sparked the beginning of a war between France and powerful kingdoms like Austria and Prussia. By 1792, France found itself facing not only internal issues, but a serious external threat as well. With the support of the people, the young revolutionary leaders declared war on Austria and Prussia. Just imagine it. This time, the French people weren't just fighting for their freedom inside the palace walls. They were heading to the battlefields of Europe. The revolution had moved beyond an internal matter, turning into an internal conflict. European monarchies were determined to extinguish the flames of revolution in France and crush the spirit of rebellion. Each kingdom had come together to protect their thrones and systems, forming an alliance to destroy the revolution. But France didn't give in to these threats. A spirit of mobilization spread among the people, young and old, men and women, even children, all united in the fight for freedom. France's young armies gathered for the defense of the homeland and set out for the battlefields. During those days, every French heart burned with the fire of revolution, beating with devotion to freedom. The energy of the revolution turned into a nationwide sense of mobilization, and France fought with everything it had to stand strong against these external threats. So, my friends, what awaits this people who have now entered a great war? With the European monarchies united and moving to crush France, how will this young revolution survive all the pressure? The answer to that question lies in the events that would determine the fate of the revolution. Ah, my friends, let me tell you about those days when the streets of Paris were overflowing with anger and resentment, and the people had reached the end of their patience with the kings. The excitement of the revolution, the hope for liberty and equality, which began as a spark, had now spread to every corner of Paris. The revolutionary slogans echoing through the streets were shaking the foundations of a monarchy that had reigned for centuries. Paris, the heart of France, had become the center of a great storm. The symbol of the monarchy, the Tuileries Palace, was now going to be the target of this wave of fury. That time, the people had begun to believe that the royal family still acted as enemies of the French nation. Rumors spread quickly among the public that the king had formed alliances with the enemies of the revolution behind the walls of the palace, and the grandeur and splendor of that great palace had become a symbol of a corrupt regime in the eyes of the people. On a hot August day in 1792, when the gates of the Tuileries Palace were forced open, the people surged forward like a river of anger, crashing into the cold walls. The monarchy began to crumble in the hands of the people that day. On that day, the people's demand for justice flowed like a river. The Parisians who entered the palace after breaking through the gates faced the royal guards. The fire burning in the eyes of both sides would determine the fate of this confrontation. Although the guards tried to resist, there were no match for the revolutionary people. In the end, the Tuileries fell, and King Louis XVI and his family were taken into custody by the revolutionary government. The monarchy was officially over in the eyes of the people in France. In these lands where the monarchy had ruled for centuries, the people had raised their will and overthrown the king's throne. Ah, what a historic day it was. The people of France, who had been oppressed under kings for centuries, had finally made their voices heard and taken the first great step toward ending the monarchy. The monarchy was now becoming a page in history in the hands of the people. The kingdom was losing its place in the great wheel that would determine France's future. And this people, scorched by the fire of revolution, was beginning to write its own future. So now, my friends, would France move from a kingdom to a republic? What path would a France without a king take, and what new storms would knock on the door of this young republic? The answers to these questions lie hidden in the next phase of the revolution, in a period that might seem now distinct from our young. Ah, my friends, now we've reached a turning point in France's history, a moment that all of Europe watched with bated breath. Oh. For centuries, France had been ruled by kings, but now the people, determined to shatter those thrones, were preparing to carve their own path. When the gates of the palace were broken down by the fire of revolution, the people didn't just topple a king, they brought down an entire era. And now the time had come for France to be reborn, not as a monarchy, but as a free country without a king. During the turbulent autumn of 1792, the revolutionary wave continued to spread rapidly through the streets of Paris. The revolutionaries in the National Assembly decided to take action to completely uproot the monarchy. Listening to the cries of the people, they declared in September that France would be a republic. This decision didn't just echo within France. It sent shockwaves throughout all the European kingdoms, because now France would no longer be ruled by a king, but by the will of the people. The reign of kings had ended, replaced by the power of the people and their demands for equality and freedom. And now, dear friends, in this new French Republic, there was a king without a throne, Louis XVI. The man who was once the most powerful leader of the people was now the target of their fury. In order to ensure that the shadow of monarchy would not fall over this new republic, the Assembly decided to try Louis for treason. Imagine, my friends, a man who was once a mighty ruler, now awaiting judgment amid the jeers of the people on the streets of Paris. Was this a fair trial, or just a formality drowned out by the cries of vengeance from the crowd? This was one of the big questions of the time. Louis XVI's trial wasn't just a legal proceeding. It was a reckoning with the anger of the French people that had built up over centuries. The charges of treason piled up one after another. Accusations that the monarchy had acted against the people's interests and led them into hunger and suffering. Louis listened calmly to the charges, but in the eyes of the people, the crown that once symbolized grandeur had long since fallen. And finally, in January, the decision was made. Louis would bow to the will of the people and he would be punished at the guillotine. The sharp blade of the guillotine would not just strike down a king, but sever the last remnants of the monarchy, sealing France's future as a revolutionary republic. And at last, on that cold winter day, in front of thousands of spectators gathered in the square, Louis XII walked to the guillotine. Think about it, my friends. A king who once looked down on his people was now forced to submit to their will. As the blade fell, France left the era of monarchy behind and threw open the doors to the Republic. The people were now determined to create their own order and chart their own path. But my friends, how safe would this new republic's path be? What challenges would this young republic face, and what storms would await France? Well, what happens next will be the steps that determine the fate of the revolution. My dear friends, let me take you to a time in French history when even the revolution, symbol of freedom, was swallowed by a whirlpool of fear, turning against even its closest allies, seeing them as enemies. This was the dark period known as the Reign of Terror, when the sacred flame of revolution began to dim and became something feared. The streets of France, once echoing with cries of liberty and equality, had now turned into pathways of silent dread, where people walked with bated breath, wondering which friend might be branded a traitor next. It was early 1793. France was now a republic, a young and wounded one. Imagine this. The people had overthrown the monarchy in a fight for justice and equality. But this new order faced countless enemies, so many threats. To defend this fragile republic, the Jacobins took power, led by one of the revolution's most fervent supporters, Robespierre. Robespierre. A man unafraid to take a stand for liberty would now become the leader of a period known as the Terror. Who could have foreseen that Robespierre and the Jacobins, in their quest to protect the people, would end up instilling such heavy oppression upon them? Robespierre and the Jacobins began taking such strict measures to eliminate counter-revolutionary forces and preserve the Republic and the Revolution, that those early winds of freedom were now replaced by a sharp edge of justice. Even the slightest suspicion of someone harboring anti-revolutionary thoughts, plotting or contemplating betrayal, was enough to label them a threat to the revolution. During this period, the guillotine became a looming shadow, not just for kings, but for ordinary people as well. Each day, the terrifying sound of the guillotine echoed through the streets of Paris. So-called enemies of the revolution, traitors, and anyone deemed a threat to the Republic were punished without trial, and the streets of France were washed with blood. In Robespierre's eyes, this was the surest way to protect the revolution. But people grew fearful. No one dared speak loudly in the streets anymore. Friends grew suspicious of friends, and families eyed even their closest kin with doubt. My friends, in their fierce battle for liberty and equality, the revolution's defenders had unleashed a wave of tyranny upon their own people. And this wave didn't stop at counter-revolutionaries. It even swept up those revolutionaries who dared to disagree with Robespierre himself. The revolution, once a beacon of freedom, had now turned on its own, casting a dark shadow over liberty itself. But tell me, my friends, how could this revolution endure? with the very leaders who were once seen as saviors, now holding their people in fear? How long could Robespierre's reign last? And how would these days of terror finally come to an end? In the next chapter, I'll take you through the events that would reshape the destiny of the revolution. My dear friends, as the flames of revolution swept through France, the cracks within it only grew wider. Two major powers, two opposing views, had found a place within the revolution, each wrestling over how authority and governance should be shaped. On one side were the Girondins, the more moderate group trying to bring stability, and on the other were the Guillotines, the fierce defenders of the revolution. Both wanted the revolution to continue, but their paths and methods couldn't have been more different. This marked the beginning of yet another storm brewing at the heart of the revolution. Now the streets echoed not only with cries for liberty, equality, and fraternity, but also with the clash of new governance ideas and the noise of inner conflicts. The Girondins didn't want the revolution to drown in chaos. To them, protecting freedom meant establishing an order, a system, a state governed by laws. For the Girondins, the revolution shouldn't end with the king's fall. It should also secure and safeguard the people's freedom. But to the Jacobins, this wasn't nearly revolutionary enough. They wanted radical reforms, for the revolution to rule in full, and for France to be shaken to its core. The clash between these two groups would only deepen the internal turmoil of the revolution. One day, the tensions between the Girondins and Jacobins grew so intense that France seemed like a country echoing with two different voices. The Jacobins, holding tightly to power even at the cost of instilling fear in the hearts of the people, clashed with the Girondins, who warned that these harsh methods would drive France into even greater chaos. Unfortunately, the Jacobins prevailed, pushing the Girondins out of the way. Yet even the Jacobins' reign wasn't destined to last forever. These internal battles, fought in the name of liberty, would cut deep into the revolution's spirit, wounding it heavily. Finally, in 1794, with the fall of Robespierre, the reign of terror came to an end. By now the people were exhausted. The fires of revolution had burned them out. But with what kind of leadership? By now the people were exhausted. The fires of revolution had burned them out. So in 1795, the idea of writing a new constitution gained more and more support. There was a need for a system that could protect the revolution, but also ensure the people's safety. The Constitution of 1795 introduced the Directory, a government intended to bring order while preserving revolutionary ideals. But oh my dear friends, was it easy to find stability after such a turbulent past? The Directory period was also full of contradictions. The government constantly changed, inner conflicts continued, and the leadership struggled to stabilize. Everyone wanted to stay true to the revolution's values, but unity under these values was elusive. During this new period, France had to face both internal turmoil and external threats. The people's trust was shaken, and their hopes were dwindling. Could this new government lead France out of the dark days ahead? Or would the Directory only signal yet another storm brewing amidst the waves of revolution? Friends, what kind of future awaited us? We'll find out in the next chapter. My dear friends, just think about it. From the day the revolution began, until now, so much has changed. The hearts that fought in the streets of France for the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity ignited a spark not just within their own borders, but across all of Europe. The fire of the French Revolution didn't just overthrow the king and establish a republic. It spread ideas that shook monarchies all across Europe, planting seeds of awakening in the minds of the people. In those years, for neighboring kingdoms, the revolution was more than just a threat. It was a terrifying nightmare. The uprising of the French people showed just how fragile the thrones really were. Imagine, could the monarchies that had ruled for centuries ever have guessed their roots could be shaken so easily? From Germany to Italy, from Spain to Poland, there was a hush, a deep unease in every palace. Ordinary people had started questioning. They wondered why justice, freedom, and equality were rights reserved only for the nobles. And as these questions began to take root in the minds of the people, the kings and queens of Europe found themselves sleepless. Thinkers and revolutionaries from England to Poland started looking to the French Revolution for inspiration. The ideals of justice, freedom, and brotherhood shone like a beacon into Europe's darkest corners. Even as France was grappling with its own internal struggles, its influence was growing outside. Philosophers, writers, and politicians were voicing these new ideas, opening the eyes of the people. The French Revolution wasn't just a political shift, it was the start of a mental awakening. The ideals of the revolution filled the hearts of oppressed people everywhere with hope, whispering that a better world for everyone was possible. And the lasting legacy of the French Revolution. Dear friends, this legacy didn't belong to France alone. It became a treasure for all of humanity. The foundations of modern democracy were laid back then. Today, concepts like equality, freedom, and the will of the people, found in many constitutions around the world, echo the powerful impact of the French Revolution. It brought about profound changes, not just in politics, but also in the moral views of society and in the value and rights of the individual. People were now aware that they held a rightful place and value in society. This revolution left the world with a message. A people can take control of their own destiny, and they can fight for justice and freedom. And my friends, the ideas that emerged with this revolution opened the doors to a new era in human history, not just in France, but for all humanity. The world would never be the same once people began to awaken, once they start seeking justice and equality. Could that ever be stopped? So now, I ask you, how do you think this great revolution's legacy inspired other nations in the years that followed? Through what other paths would humanity travel in the pursuit of freedom? My friends, in our next adventure, we'll continue to follow the trail of revolutions